because we're exactly halfway, which gives us half an hour to do the Acts of the Apostles. Where does it fit into the Bible? Well, it's the fifth book in the history section, the fifth and the last. And it's very much seen as being a sequel to Luke because it was written by Luke. And in the Gospel of Luke, he records the life of Jesus, and he leaves off with Jesus going into heaven, and he starts the book of Acts where he left off. Jesus on the Mount of Olives ascends to heaven, and then he gives the account of the early church. Where did the book get its name? The Acts of the Apostles is actually the full name, and that's self-explanatory. It's what the book is about, what the early apostles of Jesus did. The language, written in Koine Greek, but I want to tell you that it's written in a Koine Greek that none of the other New Testament books equal. It's written in very good Greek. Now, we know that Luke was a doctor, and many people believe that he was not a Jew. In fact, we can, from one of Paul's epistles, infer that he wasn't Jewish, but it seems that Koine Greek was his native language, because although Paul's Greek is also very good, you find that some of the other Greek is very basic, because remember, you had people who were speaking it as a second language. Paul appears to also have had Greek as his first language, but he was born in a Roman town. We know that he was a Roman citizen, and it appears that Paul had a good command of Greek. But Luke, who was a companion of Paul as well, has excellent Greek. In fact, some scholars say that his style at times approaches that of classical Greek, as in the preface of his gospel. Jerome, now remember, Jerome was a man who knew languages. He translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin and the New Testament from Greek into Latin. So he knew Greek. He says Luke, as his writings indicate, was not unskilled in the Greek language. Why do we believe there's a single author? Well, besides the fact, again, that people will say it's a tradition, or, I'd like to call it history. If you just read the two, you'll find that both of them are addressed to the same person, most excellent Theophilus. And the fact that where Luke ends off, Acts picks up also points to that as well. So there's a lot of internal evidence, and they are both written in a very good Greek. And there's a lot of grammatical evidence, which I'm not going to go into, but I've included in the footnote. Luke's identification as the author was unquestioned in ancient times. And this is what Irenaeus, my friend Irenaeus, writes. If then anyone shall from the Acts of the Apostles carefully scrutinize the time concerning which it is written that he went up to Jerusalem on account of the aforementioned question, he will find those years mentioned by Paul coinciding with it. Thus the statement of Paul harmonizes with and is, as it were, identical with the testimony of Luke regarding the apostles. So he identifies Luke as the author of the Acts of the Apostles. When Origen is toying around with who wrote Hebrews, because remember, Hebrews doesn't tell us its author. I believe it was written by Paul, but Origen suggests a possible author as, and this is his words, Luke, the author of the Gospel and the Acts. So Origen, I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a very early canon that's mentioned. Remember, I told you about the canons that were drawn up where people started to draw up lists and they kind of said these are the books that should be canonical. And a Muratorian canon from the 2nd century, the 3rd book, Gospel, is according to Luke. Jerome said Luke wrote a Gospel. He also wrote another excellent volume to which he prefixed the title Acts of the Apostles. So it was pretty much unanimous. Augustine talks about Luke is also the writer of the other book which bears the name of the Acts of the Apostles. There was no doubt about it. The only people who doubt these things are the modern scholars who are so clever they know more about what happened 2,000 years ago than the people who lived there. Now, about the author. Luke was a doctor, as I told you, referred to by Paul in Colossians 4:14 as Luke, the beloved physician. So he was not only a doctor, he was loved. He was a frequent companion of Paul. Jerome writes, Luke, a physician of Antioch, so he claims he was from Antioch, Don't know how he knew that, but there we have it. An adherent of the Apostle Paul and companion of all his journeying, he wrote a gospel. And as I've told you, the Acts of the Apostles. A Muratorian canon that I referred to, it talks about in that particular document, this Luke was a physician who Paul had taken after the ascension of Christ to be a legal expert, yet he had not seen the Lord in the flesh. That's quite interesting. Again, not too sure where he got his information from, but he claims that Luke advised Paul on legal matters. He was certainly an educated man. Paul speaks of Luke as being his companion. To Timothy 4:11, Luke alone is with me. And there we see Philemon and Colossians. Now, the word for grace in the Greek doesn't appear at all in Matthew and Mark. It's used in John's Gospels 4 times in a single passage, but it occurs 8 times throughout Luke's Gospel and 17 times in the book of Acts. And that is a word that is used a lot in the Pauline epistles. Bear in mind that Luke was Paul's companion. And so they talk a lot about grace, both Paul and Luke. Jerome believed that the following verse was written of Luke when Paul says in 2 Corinthians, we are sending along with him the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel. So even though it's not said explicitly there, Jerome believes that Paul's writing about Luke, and that when he's been praised for his service to the gospel, he's writing about the fact that he put together this gospel, which was very, very well researched. Irenaeus was the first to actually point out that in 5 sections in the book of Acts, the author switches from the first person, so in other words, in saying he or she or they, to the first person plural, we. And then he says, we went there and we did this. We can deduce from that, and Irenaeus pointed it out, that Luke had joined them. So if you want to know when Luke is with Paul, just go look for the we passages, and I've actually given you them over there. Irenaeus says this Luke was inseparable from Paul and his fellow laborer in the gospel, and then he goes on to use that particular argument, which is still a common argument today. Jerome's the influence of Paul on Luke's writings. He says Luke not only was taught the gospel history by the Apostle Paul, who was not with the Lord in the flesh, but also by the other apostles. And Jerome says that he composed the Acts of the Apostles as he himself had seen. So the point he's making is Luke had to get his material for the gospel from the apostles, and he clearly consulted Mary and all that, but the Acts, he didn't have that problem because a lot of that he was actually there in person. And interestingly, he talks about the fact that Luke died and was buried at Constantinople. To demonstrate the apostolic authority of all the Gospels, Tertullian appeals to Paul's influence on Luke. Because remember, one of the criteria for a book is there had to be some link to apostle. Now, Matthew was written by apostle. John was written by apostle. Mark, as I pointed out to you, even though Mark wasn't one of the 12, he was drawing his information from Peter, according to the early writers. So that's the apostolic authority that Mark can claim. What about Luke? Now, Luke wasn't an apostle, but Tertullian says the same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels as well. And he goes on to say, even Luke's form of the gospel men usually ascribe to Paul. So he's saying, well, Luke was Paul's companion and Paul was an apostle, and hence it carries apostolic authority because Paul's influence on Luke. Luke was the only Gentile author of a New Testament book. Remember, I told you from one of Paul's epistles, we can deduce that. Well, here it is, Colossians 4. Paul mentions my fellow prisoner Aristarchus, sends you greetings, as does Mark, Jesus, who is called Justus, and then he says, these Jews are my fellow workers. But then he goes on to say, our dear friend Luke and Demas send greetings. What is he saying there? They're not Jews. So he says that Mark is with me and Aristarchus, and these are the only Jews with me. And he says, Luke, by the way, Luke and Demas also send their greetings. In other words, Luke is not a Jew. Not surprising because he speaks Greek very well. So either he was a Hellenized Jew like Paul, or maybe he was just a native Greek. Some speculate that he was the man from Macedonia that Paul saw in his dream in Acts 16, verse 9. So remember, Paul has a dream, the man from Macedonia. However, I had a look at it, and it's not possible because we get one of the wee passages before then. So Luke had already joined them. So he couldn't be asking Paul in the dream. Listen to this. The man from Macedonia appears to Paul in the dream. He says, come over to Macedonia and help us. And when Paul had seen the vision, he says, we sought to go into Macedonia. What does that tell you? Luke's with him. So Luke couldn't have been the man in the dream, as much as that idea might appeal to some people. Luke was left in Philippi during the second missionary journey, we know from Acts 17:1, and he picked up again to travel with Paul in the third journey. He accompanied Paul on his journey to Jerusalem and Rome. That's why he gives us great detail on the ship travel and that shipwreck, because he was on the ship. So it wasn't just Paul swimming or grabbing on a plank from the shipwreck. Luke was there as well. And that's why he gives such a detailed account. The book was likely written between AD 61 and 64. Again, Jerome gives us very precise information. He says that Acts of the Apostles is a history which extends to the second year of Paul's sojourn at Rome. That is to the fourth year of Nero. He's linking Paul's sojourn to Rome to the fourth year of Nero, which we do know is AD 58. And we know that that is recorded in the book, which means it can't have been written before AD 58. So reasons favoring an early date is that the book ends abruptly with Paul imprisoned in Rome, waiting to bring his appeal before Caesar, which, as I pointed out, was around about AD 58. Doesn't go on to say that Paul was ultimately executed by Nero, which I think would have merited a mention. It does not mention the death of James, and when I'm talking about James there, I'm not talking about James early on in Acts who was beheaded. I'm talking about James, the brother of Jesus. He was the leader of the Jerusalem church, and he was martyred in AD 62. Doesn't mention Paul's death, which we know was from about AD 64 to 68, nor the persecution of the Christians under Nero in AD 64. And so it's most likely that it was completed before then. The picture in Acts at Rome, knowing little about the movement, is still deciding where Christianity fits. So it doesn't allude to the outright persecution of the church by the Romans. Also, the silence about Jerusalem's destruction in AD 70. The amount of uncertainty expressed about internal Gentile-Jewish relations shows that we got a very early date. They're still sort of kind of deciding where do the Gentiles fit into the church. And he goes into great detail. In Acts 15, he talks about the council they have and how they're trying to figure out how do they accommodate the Gentiles in the church. Suggests an early date. Who was the book written to? Well, both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles are addressed to the same person, Theophilus. So the book is intended as a sequel, and there I've given the first 4 verses where he addresses it to most excellent Theophilus. In Luke and in Acts, the first 2 verses, in the first book, O Theophilus, so he refers to a previous book, which is the book of the Gospel of Luke. Now, Theophilus is both a common name but also a title among the learned academic Romans and Jews of the era. And so there are those who maintain that Theophilus wasn't a person, but just a title, because it means in Greek, friend of God. So they say when he's saying, dear friend of God, he's just using a generic term. And that Luke and Acts were addressed to anyone who fits that description. Coptic tradition, that will be people from Egypt, asserts that Theophilus was a Jew of Alexandria, because Alexandria was in Egypt. Some say that Theophilus was a Roman official of some sort, and that's why Luke uses a term which is translated most excellent. He's talking to someone who's, of some importance. You don't call your friend most excellent. Some believe it might have been Theophilus ben Ananias, who was the high priest of the Jerusalem temple from 37 to 41, but the date is way too earlier. He was also a Sadducee. There's a minority view which identifies him as a later priest, Matthias ben Theophilus, who served from 65 to 66, but again, that's a bit too late for our time frame. Some theologians, in particular David Pawson, actually believe that Theophilus could have been Paul's lawyer. And the argument they give is they believe that he wrote the gospel and the book of Acts to give an account of Christianity, because as his lawyer and having to defend him at his trial in Rome, which is where it ends, he needed the background to Paul. And so Luke, who's with him, prepares these documents that he gives to the lawyer, and he calls him most excellent Theophilus. And he gives first an account, well, he has an account of how Christianity started, and he has an account of the apostles, and he goes into great detail on Paul's life. So it's, again, I don't know if there's anything to substantiate from that from church tradition, but it's quite a good theory, quite an interesting theory. In fact, Luke points out in his gospel that Jesus is declared innocent 3 times by Pontius Pilate, as was Paul before various judges. So they bring out a lot of interesting points like that to say that it fits the bill for being written to some sort of important lawyer who was then going to defend Paul before Nero. The purpose of writing, well, like its prequel, it was intended to instruct and strengthen the faith of its initial reader, Theophilus. Although there are some who try to say that this was a lawyer, maybe he was a Christian lawyer, who knows. Luke says in verse 3 to 4 of chapter 1, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So it sounds like Theophilus knew about Christianity, and Luke is giving him more detail in the background. Well, the book of Acts was written to provide a history of the early church, and the emphasis of the book is to show the fulfillment of the Great Commission. Jesus said to his disciples, preach the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And that's the sequence that the book of Acts follows. They first preach in Jerusalem, they then take it to Samaria and to Judea, and ultimately Paul's missionary journeys to the ends of the earth. And so Acts can be divided into 3 main sections. Acts 1 to 7, the gospel is proclaimed in Jerusalem by Peter, John, and Stephen. Acts 8 to 11, verse 18, the gospel is proclaimed in Samaria and Judea by Peter, John, Philip. And Acts 11 onwards, the gospel is proclaimed to the ends of the earth, starting in Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. And then we know about the missionary journeys where it's proclaimed by Paul, Barnabas, John Mark, later Silas, Timothy, Luke, Apollos, Priscilla, Aquila, etc., etc. So it's showing how the Great Commission is fulfilled through the apostles and their companions. The broad outline, firstly, it shows how the church is empowered at Pentecost to fulfill this Great Commission. And Jesus tells them that they need to wait in Jerusalem. In a few days, you'll be baptized with the Holy Spirit, and you will receive power, and you will be my witnesses. And so we know that they were filled with the Holy Spirit. They spoke in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. And Pentecost is often referred to by Christians as the birthday of the church, because on that day, there were 3,000 people saved, baptized, and they then devote themselves to teaching, fellowship, communion, and prayer. The church is born. And in the Old Covenant, we find the Holy Spirit comes on a few people, and you'll find mention of the Spirit coming upon people like Samson and upon David. But now we are told that the Holy Spirit, as Jesus had promised in the Gospel of John, that he had sent the Holy Spirit, is poured out on all Christians. In the last days, Peter says, quoting Joel 2:28, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. And so I've just put some maps in here for interest, just to show you how the gospel is proclaimed. So these are Peter's journeys. We don't have all the detail there. Even Paul's, although there's more detail because often Luke was with him. But we can basically draw up that sort of a map based on what we are told in the book of Acts, with the exception of the last one in Rome. That, again, we get from tradition. There's a strong tradition from the early Christians that Peter was martyred in Rome by Nero and that he was crucified upside down. So we do know that he ended up in Rome. So there's a rough approximation of Peter's journeys. And then we have a very detailed outline of Paul's first missionary journey. I'm not going to give you all that detail now, but there we can see, starting at Antioch, but they basically, after going to Cyprus, they evangelized that area that today we call Turkey. In those days, it was the Roman province of Asia. We sometimes refer to it as Asia Minor. That's his return trip. And then after that, he goes down to Jerusalem for the council in Jerusalem, because everybody's shocked, because these guys are going and the Gentiles are converting en masse and they haven't been circumcised. And they have to decide whether that's allowable or not. And so they have the Jerusalem Council, and then the Jerusalem Council, they decide that Gentiles are not bound to be circumcised. Okay, and then we have Paul's second missionary journey. Again, there we can see that he goes all through Asia Minor again, but then something remarkable happens. He has a dream where a Greek man, in fact a Macedonian man, calls him to come and help, and so the gospel goes for the first time into Europe, into Greece. Then we have the third missionary journey, and there again, Paul pretty much going through Turkey and through Greece again. But he has this dream that he wants to take the gospel to Rome, because Rome is the center of the empire. And he ends up taking it there, but perhaps not in the way that he expected. He gets taken there while he's in chains. And so he returns to Jerusalem. You know the story. He gets attacked by a mob, eventually ends up in Caesarea. At the trial before Agrippa, he appeals to Caesar, and so he's sent by Festus to Caesar. And so there we see, tracing the detail again given us in the book of Acts, how they traveled to Rome. And so now the gospel, although it had already been in Rome, remember Paul had written an epistle there to the Romans, so it wasn't planted by Paul, but he wanted to go there because it was the center of the empire. And that's where he would end his life. Luke gives vivid description of geographic details. And so some believe that he was very acquainted with seafaring. He seems to be very knowledgeable as to what the sailors are doing and why they're doing, unless he asked them why they were doing it. But if you read that account, very detailed, you can see he was a very educated, observant writer. There are some key verses, which again, I'm not going to read to you because we're about to wrap up. But if you want some key verses and you don't have enough already, there are some of them. Practical application. Acts records the transition from taking the gospel to an exclusively Jewish audience, with Peter preaching to a small group in the upper room, to the gospel going out among the Gentiles, primarily under the ministry of the Apostle Paul. And what opportunities for sharing the gospel can you take advantage of in the days to come? We can read this and get inspiration. That in the same way that the early Christians took Jesus at heart, and he said, go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the whole earth, that still applies to us today. We have our own Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where we live. We have our own Judea. We have our own way of supporting the gospel going to the whole world through mission work. In virtually every chapter, apostles such as Peter and Paul powerfully present the gospel to individuals and groups of people. You have them going to new towns. Often they'd never been there before, and they'd go to the synagogue or whatever place. If there was no synagogue like in Philippi, Paul just goes to the river where he found out there were people gathering to pray, and he presents the gospel. Wherever they have the opportunity, they go and they present the gospel. And they preach it with power. And so we can allow the book of Acts to encourage us to walk more closely with God, so that we too may take Christ's name and proclaim it with boldness and with the zeal that the apostles had. And that, folks, is a very, very brief overview of the books of John and Acts.